My approach is always, and it is when I'm interrogating a book, is to look at the sources. So I'll flick to the back and I'll go through, and the joke is often you look to see whether you're in it. And of course, if you are, your expectations are happily go up. But more seriously, I think it gives you a sense of the nature of the research that's been done. If it's all secondary sources, your approach to what you're going to read is going to be different. If it's a lot of primary sources, interview-based, or the original collection of data, then your assumptions about what's going to be under the covers is going to be slightly different.
I always read from beginning to end because most parts of a thesis build on each other. So, for example, data in later chapters might refer to findings in earlier chapters. And the introduction gives you that broader picture and the theoretical context. And so it really makes sense to read it from beginning to end for me, and I do.
I always tell my own students, and then this is what I do. I read the first 2 pages, and then I flip to the conclusion, because there should be a match between the introduction and the conclusion. So what was promised and in a sense what was delivered. So the aim of this thesis is to examine and then I want to see on the first page of the conclusion, the aim of this thesis was to...
I like to read a thesis like a book, okay? So it shouldn't be a story, it should obviously be based on fact, but it really should be a complete kind of discourse around what's been achieved by the student and placing that into the context of the wider scientific discipline. You know, why do you keep reading a book? You keep reading a book because you want to kind of know what's the next part of the story. Well, why do you keep reading a thesis? Well, yes, because you have to examine it, but also you're more enthusiastic about it if you kind of, I see where this is going and I can see what they're going to do. Let's find out what the results are going to be. And so it's kind of an engaging read.
When you're examining, you're really focusing on the front end. Right. Because you need to know the parameters of what the student is setting up. And you focus on the lit review and methodology to try and understand what those parameters are. Because in some ways, in a thesis, you kind of have to judge it in terms of what the student says they're going to do and whether they have achieved it. You do kind of look at it and say, have they got the most current information on this topic?
You interrogate a work like this in much the same way you do a person. You tend to dwell on certain aspects before you start to form a more holistic picture. And I think in some ways the relationship a student, any author has with the text is something akin to a relationship you might have with another person, that you're never entirely in control of it. And in some ways it represents a voice separate from your own, even though you think you yourself are the thesis.
One of my colleagues got me onto this. He said, if the implications in further research agenda are dead, it's a terminal degree in the sense that the person's not going to go on, not going to publish, and not really join the field. It is simply going to wear a fancy hat and walk down Wilson Hall and then lord over someone with a doctorate for the rest of their life. But he always he examines theses from the beginning, from the research agenda. That's how I read a thesis. First few pages, then I read the research agenda, the further research agenda. Then I flip through the references. If you flip to the references, you can see who their friends are. And I'm looking for recognition that they're part of the field and part of the community and who they rely on to support their own argument. Then I go back and reread the introduction to look at the scope of the thesis and to get my head around the overview. And then, to be honest, I flip through the literature review fairly quickly. I'm not that worried about it, but I'm looking for material that's been produced in the last 2 or 3 years. And if it's consistent, there's a consistent argument being developed. Perhaps unlike a lot of my colleagues, I don't necessarily worry about data analysis. It's a funny way of thinking about it. Some of my colleagues really focus on data analysis. Myself, it's about extending the argument and what you do with the argument. So I kind of skip past a lot of the if you will, the hardcore data analysis, and then I move to the back to the conclusion, implications, and agenda for further research.
For me, methodology is very important because that's your innovation. So what you're offering the world is the methodology, and that's different from methods. Methodology is the way you craft the material that you have, and you set it up in order to advance your arguments and present your findings. And that in itself innovatively allows you to see or uncover some aspect of research. Whereas methods are whether you use interviews or case studies, or whether you go to the field and do ethnographic work. Or
to read a thesis from start to finish is probably about 3 hours. So I read it once. When I actually, I'm very old-fashioned, so I read the hard copy, not a soft copy. And I will make notes, and then I'll read it again, and I'll make extra notes actually on the thesis rather than so kind of, you need to go back to this, think about that. And then I go back and delve into the notes that I've written, and whether they're critical notes or good notes in the context of something that you really think is important about that particular thesis. Then I go back and focus in on those, and sometimes that requires some extra reading regarding the references associated with that particular point that they've raised. If you were to do it continuously, I reckon it's about 2 days full-time work.
That would take me the first go half hour, and then I'd put it down, come back and do it for 2 hours, put it down, and then come back and do it for 3 hours, and then finish it. So start to finish, my total reading time would be 6 to 8 hours. So I don't know if it's a mythology, but I often tell my students, have you ever walked past a professor's door and they say, sorry, do not disturb, reading a PhD thesis? So I ask them, what do you think professors read PhD theses? They don't do it in their offices, and they don't close the doors. So get ready, and that's the reason I say that to students, because I want them to signpost and have a coherent narrative. If there's breaks in the narrative, it's very difficult to keep the thesis, the argument in your mind enough to say that it's strong and in fact valid and makes a contribution.
Well, I read a lot on the tram on my way to and from work, so I tend not to read it in one large block, but then I'll devote a chunk of time to really thinking through the thesis as a whole after I've read it. So I mean, the whole process would take 6 to 8 hours because it also takes quite a lot of time and thought to write a constructive review of a thesis as well.
I went on sabbatical for the second half of last year, and I kind of decided that I would accept to examine more theses because I thought I would have the time to kind of be able to do that during the sabbatical. Actually, I found that I did not the examination, if you like, of the thesis, but actually the reading of the thesis were on long-haul flights, okay? Because I had the opportunity just to sit down. I couldn't read my email. I was by myself when I was on those long-haul flights, so my family actually, they travelled separately at different times. So I was actually sat there for 24 hours and I actually managed to read through 3 theses, okay? Now, I didn't examine them, but it kind of gave me for each of them an opportunity to read them from start to finish. And it was actually, if I could do that all the time, then that's what I would do. Generally, what happens more often is I read a couple of chapters, have to go and respond to some emails or do some other work, and then come back at the earliest opportunity. But like a good book.